Six took in the sight before her. It had been a while since she had been here, hadn't it? It was so far off in the distance, yet appeared so large and threatening as always. The trees and hills that stood in the way not offering any solace in blocking what she and many others would consider a blemish, a cancer on the world. The pale city. The numerous buildings and blocks that made it up could be seen all the way up from where she stood. There was at least a couple of miles between her and it, yet she still felt like it wasn't enough to separate her from the feeling of dread and fear she felt towards the city of static. Her eyes wandered to the thing that stood at the center of the city, the building that brought ruination to all and created monsters from the darkest corners of one's mind. The tower. It stood just like she remembered it, towering over every single building in the city, the tip of it breaching the clouds and creating a storm that consumed the whole city. Her face pulled back into a grimace. She wasn't even near it, and yet she still felt like the broadcast it put out was ringing in her ears. The horrible sound that it produced was nothing like she had ever heard before. A constant, low, ringing sound with a horrible undertone that could only be described as screaming that constantly rung in one's ears, with only the safety of the buildings in the city offering reprieve from the horrendous sound. It had been a long time since then, yet it still rung in her mind like it was just yesterday. The running, the screaming, the constant threat of danger around every corner, and the brief moments of safety, and the presence of a warm body next to her. The city was full of dangers, and that was why she chose to leave all that time ago. Ever since. She shook her head as memories boiled up. It wasn't worth thinking about. It had been 7 years, after all. 7 years of traveling the world, moving from place to place, never settling in one area for too long before moving on to the next. It was a constant source of danger, to be sure, but Six was never one to settle. That brought about a sense of complacency that set a person up for disaster. She had learned that in the maw. Taking one last distasteful glance at the city in the distance, Six began to walk down the forest path she had followed for the past hour. The path in question was one that Six hoped would take her to the more western side of the world. She had traveled the eastern side for the past few years, and as such exploring the other side made sense. Though she didn't enjoy having to travel so close to the city. She hadn't planned to, of course. She had wanted to go another way, but the other way around involved getting a boat, and despite the supposed safety of the sea, traveling near the waters of the Pale City was inviting disaster. This was what led her to where she was now, traveling through the large forests that surrounded the Pale City for a good few miles in every direction. The forests themselves didn't seem as intimidating as they did all those years ago. Perhaps it was because she got slightly bigger over the years. Maybe it was because she had seen more and more awful things over time, numbing her to the world. Maybe it was because she just got older, who knows? Regardless, the trees and the scent in the air brought back memories, fuzzy yet lifelike, of the days when she was trapped in the hunter's basement. Trapped for several days in a cold, dark room, left with nothing but a music box that she played endlessly to keep her mind occupied. Until he came... She shook her head once more. She hated being around this place. It brought back memories that were unneeded.
Oh yes, can't dwell on that now, can we?
That voice was also unneeded, and as such, was ignored. Six took to taking in her surroundings again, observing the tree line for anything that might jump out and attack her. It was rare for adults to wander the forests and roads that connected the places they lived, but when they did, it was often an idea to stay out of their way. Though for someone like Six, she didn't have to avoid them. She could just go through them. But still, she liked to remain undetected. At least for now. So she remained on guard, taking in her surroundings and preparing for the worst, like she always did. Then, she noticed something. The path she was following started to become more and more barren, less greenery present, and more of the earth underneath exposed, and along with it, footprints. Children footprints. At least 3 sets, and they were fresh. She narrowed her eyes, following the footsteps of whoever traveled along these roads before her, and wondering where they went. Eventually the footsteps stopped following the beaten path and turned into the forest in the direction of what seemed to be a cliffside. Six paused at where the steps veered off. Children rarely went into the woods except when they made camp and stayed in natural cover to protect themselves from any predators or adults that lurked around. As such, an opportunity was presented. The six wanted to continue her journey on the beaten path. She was running low on supplies. Food was rarely an issue for her, though it couldn't help having rations for emergencies. No, she was running low on medical supplies, and the sleeping bag she once possessed had been reduced to rags after a scuffle with some other kids. It had been cold the past few nights, and the raincoat and thin blanket she had weren't exactly cutting it. If she managed to find other children, she might be able to at least get a few items to help her on her journey, either by asking and bargaining, or by force. Though she would leave that option till last. She turned her head slightly to the backpack she carried and gave it a slight shake, feeling the lack of weight she got in response. She sighed internally. It was time to interact with other people. Hopefully. With a quick step, she began to follow the footsteps off the path, taking heed of where they led to make sure she wasn't following them into a trap. After she followed the tracks for a few minutes, she noticed that the route the footsteps took wasn't random. It was carved out, just like the path before, only less so. Maybe it wasn't a random camp. Perhaps the group had set up for a few months and had more supplies than she thought. She continued to follow the trail for another few minutes until the landscape around her started to change. The trees started to become less dense. Random names and phrases were carved into the trees that still stood, and the pathway became even more defined. She slowed her pace. There was something else going on here. Eventually, she began to see the cliff more clearly tower over the trees and walked into a clearing to see both a welcome and unwelcome sight. A wall. Not just any wall, though. A wall for a village. The wall was clearly made of wood. Logs of varying sizes lined up side by side to create a long line that seemed to stretch along for a while before meeting the cliff behind the wall. The logs themselves were sharpened on top, more than likely to prevent any adults that got the idea to simply climb over a second thought about it. The outside of the wall was also lined with bricks and rocks, keeping the wall sturdy in the event of strong winds or adults hoping to simply smash it. Children rarely grouped together to form communities, and it was even rarer for them to form villages to settle down and form some semblance of living. This village in particular was looking to be one of the largest ones she had ever seen. It was a welcome sight because now she knew they would have the supplies she was looking for. It was an unwelcome sight because now she knew there would be more people than she could put up with.
Yes, not exactly a people person, are we?
She ignored the voice once more, instead choosing to move out of the tree line and approach the massive gate that stood before her. However, as soon as she approached the gate, two figures appeared on either side of the gate on the wall and held what appeared to be spears in their hands.
Oi!
The one to her right called out, their voice revealed to be that of a boy's.
Stop right there!
Six considered the request for a second before complying and standing still, tilting her head to stare up at the boy. Despite the angle, Six could make out that the boy was no older than 12. His mouth and nose were covered by a thin strip of green cloth, leaving only his green eyes to be exposed to the world. His hair was shaven, yet somehow greasy, and his entire body was covered with what appeared to be armor made from random pieces of wood and animal bones strapped together. The most noticeable thing about him was the green stripe that went across his forehead, more than likely from paint. The boy appraised her for a second before he talked once more.
You don't look like anyone I've seen around here before. Are you a traveler?
He asked, his voice low and spear ready in his hands. She doubted he or the other one could do anything to her, but she replied regardless by nodding.
Then are you here for something? You looking for a place to rest?
He asked, his voice slightly more relaxed.
Supplies.
She simply replied, her voice quiet and slightly raspy. It had been a while since she had talked to anyone. The boy nodded at her reply.
Anything specific you're looking for?
Medicine in a sleeping bag.
Was her simple reply. The boy seemed to frown at what she requested.
Might be a bit difficult to give you those, but Artie might be able to sort you out.
If Six had to guess, this Artie was probably someone who handled the supplies for this place, and by the sounds of it, they weren't exactly giving away medical supplies. Six rolled her eyes. She would just have to bargain harder then, wouldn't she? She then waited for several seconds, expecting the gate to swing open. It did not. She looked up at the boy on the wall in confusion and nodded her head at the gate to him. The The boy merely replied.
Name?
Six raised her eyebrows slightly beneath her hood. Why was he asking for her name? He seemed to sense her confusion as he replied.
It's for safety reasons. Just have to make sure you aren't someone who's wanted or a maniac.
That was a new one. Never in her experience of dealing with villagers had they ever asked for her name or anything really. They had usually only asked what she was after, and that was it, and Six would be lying if she didn't prefer it that way. But still, she really wanted those supplies, and if that only cost her name, then that just meant she wouldn't stick around as long. So, with a mental sigh, she replied.
6.
The boy nodded at her.
All right, let me go check with management, and then we'll let you in, okay?
Six merely nodded. The boy then turned to the other person on the wall, who had simply observed the whole thing.
Jess, keep an eye on her whilst I go check, all right?
The other guard, now known as Jess, nodded at him. He then flipped her a thumbs up, before disappearing from her view to wherever he needed to go. This left Six on her own, with the single guard in her own thoughts. There was nothing but silence for several seconds, something she greatly enjoyed.
So,
The guard, now called Jess, started awkwardly, breaking the silence.
what's your story?
Six sighed. She hoped the boy would return soon.